Let's now tackle the tests portion of the development. So what I'm doing here is I actually have a configuration file created that is going to go and create a new sweep rule named testing under Brian Johnson's mailbox. So what I'll do is I'll go in and I'll first compile this config to make sure that there are no problems. Then I'm going to do a start DST configuration on it, passing in the name, config, I'm going to do a wait, verbose, just to see the execution, and then a force. Right? So what this should be doing is, first off, execute without errors, but it should go and create a new instance of that sweep rule for Brian Johnson's mailbox. It'll take a few seconds to execute. We're just going to pause here and come back once the execution is completed. And we're done. So the rule was actually created. Now the next thing we'll do is we'll go and we'll make a modification, or actually let's try something else. Let's try to go and connect to Microsoft 365 DSC first. I'm just going to go and do connecting using my global integration, and then the workload will be Exchange. We're just going to connect there, and then what I'll do is I'll try to retrieve sweep rule for mailbox, and then I'll just pass in Brian Johnson here. All right, so I want to confirm specified mailbox identity doesn't exist. And of course, I had a typo there. Perfect. And now we can see that my testing rule has been created. Let us now go and create a drift. So I'm going to go and change the keep latest to, say, 17. I'm just going to mark this as my drift. Next thing I'll have to do is recompile my config to make sure the new changes are in. It validates that everything's good. And then I'll do another start DSC configuration. This time it will detect that there is a drift because the current value doesn't match the defined value. So the test target resource will return false, and then we'll go and update the value. So we'll wait for this to complete and we'll come back. All right, so we completed. We can see from here that the test target resource returned false, and we're now updating the sweep rule. The last thing we want to do next is delete that rule. So we're going to go and set the ensure property to absent. I'm going to go and compile this to take the new changes in. And again, I'm going to go and do a start DSC configuration. We'll wait for this to complete. And it completed. We can see that again, test result was false, and we have now removed the sweeping rule. We're now ready to look at unit tests. So if you remember, as part of the dev package that we created, we did create a resource name.test file. What we need to do, and this file is located under tests unit M365 DSC. So we're going to have to go and rename this to map our resource name, so EXO sweep rule. Very important, that file needs to be of extension .tests.ps1. So inside of that file, there are a few to-dos that need to be addressed. The first one is that we need to go and mock any of the remove, set, or new commandlet. So what I'll do here is I'm going to go and mock them with nothing in them. So that should just take a few seconds here. I'm just going to copy this because I did the exercise previously. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to grab these three methods, and I'm just going to put them right in here under the to-do. Okay? So essentially what I'm doing is saying every time the code calls into one of these three methods, just don't return anything. So this is what we call a mock. But in order to be able to mock something, we need to have fakes, right? And our stubs. And the way to do this is to basically create the skeleton for these methods. There is a file in the test folder called, or there's a folder called stubs, and then there's a file M365. And this is where we have all the stubs, right, for every method. So basically the stub is nothing but the name of the method and then the parameters it expects. There is a tool as part of the module folder called, and sorry, I'm browsing around a lot, but called stubs utility that has a method called new M365 DSC stubs. So when you run this, what this method will do is it will scan all the DSC resources that we have, collect a complete list of all the methods that need to have a stub, and it will generate the stubs for you. So all you have to do after is copy and paste them. In my case here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and copy those. Those were already generated by that stub module, right? So the get, the new, the remove, and the set. So I'm just putting those files in the stubs folder for my unit tests. Going back to my test file, right, my Pester test file, the other method I'll need to mock, in my case here, is the get mailbox. Because as I mentioned in my export, the way I'm doing it is I'm looping through all the mailboxes and then returning value. In my case here, I'm just going to return a single mailbox that has the property name set to 2. So I'm done mocking all my generic methods. Now let's scroll down to the various tests. So the way tests are defined in Pester are via what we call test context. There are a few tests that we're going to be running. The first one is what happens when the instance is supposed to exist, where the ensure property is set to present, but the current state is absent, where it doesn't exist. What happens when the instance exists, but it should not? So basically, the user defined that it should be ensure equals absent, but it actually exists. What happens when the instance exists and is already in the desired state, right? That is one scenario we need to account for. What happens when the instance exists? It should exist, but it's not in the desired state. There is a drift somewhere. And then a test we need to do is what we call the reverse DSC. This is essentially testing the export method. So let's take a look at the first method here. Okay? So what happens when the instance should exist and it does not? In this case here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and bring in fake parameters. I've actually copied the content from my examples that I created previously. I'm going to have to go and mock my method, but in this case, my method will return nothing. So I'm going to go and mock the get sweep rule, right? Because the instance does not exist. So it's just going to return nothing. And then in here, what it's going to do is we're going to go and test that this commandlet, so the new sweep rule, is getting executed. And I need to go and call into set target resource for this and do at test, right? So once you get the hang of it, it's always the same thing going on over and over again. So now let's move on to the second context, which is what happens when the property should not exist. So I'm just going to bring in my test params. You see that this time I've defined ensure equals to false. This time my get sweep rule mock needs to return something because it exists and we don't want it to exist. And then in this case here, what it should do is it should go and do test target resource. Sorry about this, test target resource at test params, and then it should invoke the remove sweep rule at least once. Well, exactly once actually, right? We're not going to try more than once to remove it. So let's move down to the third test context. What happens when it exists and it's already in the desired state? So what we need to make sure of here is that the parameters that we pass are the same that are being returned by our mock command. So I'm just going to go and again mock my get sweep rule. Perfect. So we want to make sure that right, keep latest is at 11. This is at 11. All the other properties are matching. So that's perfect. So the test target resource in this case will return true. Let's move on to the fourth test, which is what happens when the instance exists. It should, but it's not in the desired state. So in my case here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and define a drift on the keep latest property. I'm going to set this to 15. And I'm going to have my get sweep rule mocked to return a different value. Right? So this one here is going to return 11, where I'm saying it should be 15. So that will trigger a drift. Now, from a get target perspective, this is good. It's going to come back and say the instance exists. The test is going to come back and say, no, it's false. It's not matching because of the drift. And then the set will go in and it should call into the update. In our case, it's actually a set method. So it should call the set sweep rule exactly once. The last test context is the export. So in this case here, there's not much we need to do other than pass in a mock that will return some instances for my sweep rule, and off we go. Now, I'm a big fan of doing demos in the PowerShell ISC just because of the simplicity of the tool. So I'm going to go in, I'm just going to open, let me move this over here. I'm going to go to ISE. I'm going to open our tests. Just go to the root of my folder, tests, unit, M365 DSC. I'll find the one I just created here. So sweep rule. And then if the demo gods are with me, when I go and execute this here, it should run through the test and just come back saying that everything executed properly. And of course it doesn't. So let's troubleshoot this here together. Right? So it's saying that the instance is not in the desired state, but it should. So that's the problem here. So that's line 200. So what's happening on line 200? Let's have a look. 200, this should be present. So this is actually a copy paste error. So let me just remove this here. It should be 2 before all. All right, let's try that again. And off we go. So we evaluated a total of 11 unit tests, and we are now ready to go and submit the pull request.